Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Tarure Gatere, and today I want to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and I feel like it's something that resonates with all of us because we're all human and we make mistakes. So the title of this video is Why Are We So Afraid of Making Mistakes? As we live this life as humans, we have to acknowledge that mistakes are going to be a part of who we are. We're just going to make mistakes. And it's not like we have a manual that can tell us how to live life perfectly all the time. Even though we may have a moral code that's given to us by society or our cultures, and sometimes even religious texts that inspire a kind of moral living, it's not necessarily that those things cover everything about being human. And then we may have a guidance system within ourselves, which is our conscience, that can let us know right from wrong. But at the same time, we're not always going to follow it, or sometimes it may be off. And that's just how it is. Even as we know this as humans, it doesn't necessarily mean that we give ourselves a lot of leeway. In fact, I see that there's not that much slack that's given when we make mistakes, whether it's within ourselves or those around us. And sometimes shame can actually develop out of that. And sometimes what this shame can lead to is a reluctance to admit our mistakes and take responsibility for them. And I believe because we were punished so much for making mistakes when we were younger, some of us develop defense mechanisms, such as an I don't care attitude, just like whatever, I made this mistake, so what? Or a justification of the reasons why the mistake was made in the first place. And those two attitudes are something that I want to get into in another video. The reason why this topic is very important to me is because personally I discovered that I had a serious fear of making mistakes. It was almost paralyzing. And so when I started to question this, I began to look into my childhood, and a lot of times that's where our issues stem from, because that's where our first conditioning happens. That's where we start to make up our ideas about life. And I started thinking about how my mistakes were handled in the most important institutions in my life, which were the home, school, and church. In all of these institutions, there were certain rules to follow, and if you failed to follow these rules, then there were consequences. I mean, which isn't bad, because that's actually how life is. Every action has a reaction. And so consequences wasn't something that was harmful for me to learn about. Upon closer scrutiny, though, I began to notice that sometimes the negative consequences of my actions were quite severe. And at home, it wasn't that bad. I could handle it because basically, if I did something that was outside of the rules that my mom had set up, then it would be either I'm grounded or no TV or whatever, simple things. Those ones I didn't mind, I could handle them. Although sometimes, being an African mom, being a Kenyan mom, um, the consequence was a beating. And let me tell you, I hated beatings. It was the worst thing in the world for me. I would start crying even before my mom would get, you know, to actually spanking me. In school, also not too bad. It was a punishment like kneeling on the ground with your hands up, or sometimes you'd get a red mark in my diary. Now, those are the ones that would terrify me, because then that would mean that the consequence would go home. And if mom was upset enough, then that would mean a beating. Sometimes we were spanked in school as well, but I really tried to manage it in a calmer way, be more stoic than I was at home. The place where it felt the most traumatic for me was church, because as a child, I grew up always feeling a very loving presence around me. And I grew to love this presence that I called God with so much intensity. I felt it every time, all the time. I just felt engulfed by this loving presence. And so when I started going to church and learning about the God of the Bible and Jesus Christ and all that, and then the consequences of an unrepentant sinner, I feel like I started to develop a really unhealthy attitude towards being human and falling short and making mistakes. Because the consequences of being unrepentant in Christianity could go as far as being burnt for eternity in a lake of fire, which to me was something that I could never imagine. That's like the worst thing ever to be burning forever. And so to avoid this consequence, this ultimate consequence, I began to be a really good girl. I just wanted to be a really, really good girl. And I did my best to not make any mistakes. And of course, that didn't happen. And every time I'd make a mistake, I'd feel so bad because I would feel like I've disappointed God so much, because this loving presence that I had felt all my life had these rules that I had to live by. And if I fell short, then there was the possibility that He would punish me in the most horrible way possible. So I put so much pressure on myself to be good. And I remember actually having days where the whole time I'd just be repenting of sins. And I remember that's where shame started to develop for me. You can imagine it became really exhausting to live that way. And of course, the lesson that was going to come many years later for me is that I don't have to be a good or bad person. In fact, I am the whole spectrum of it, which means that sometimes I'm good, sometimes I'm bad. I am so many different things, and that I cannot be put in one category or the other. And all I wanted to do was find a balance with that. Okay, so now that I had looked at all this and gotten this awareness about mistakes, I started to notice how being afraid of mistakes had affected my life. Number one was I became so afraid of trying new things. I have all these creative projects always just running around in my head, all these wonderful, exciting things that I wanted to try out. But because I was so afraid of making a mistake, doing it wrong, and sometimes even just the idea of people looking at me and being like, oh my God, what is she trying? Then I held myself back from so many things. Number two is I also became so afraid of taking responsibility for my mistakes. When that happened, it stopped me from learning the lessons that the mistakes were there to teach me. I know that every lesson comes at the perfect time, but I honestly wish that I'd learned about mistakes much earlier, because I feel like I would have known the blessing that a mistake can be. But even though I went through all that pain and shame, I have still learned a lot of beautiful things. I am learning to allow space within my life for all the parts of me to coexist, including the flawed ones. And then I'm also learning just to do my best to be a blessing to myself and to the world around me. I'm also learning that it's okay. I will fail sometimes, and I can just take responsibility for my actions, make amends, take the lesson, and move on. I'm also still learning how to implement this formula into my life. It's still a journey, but I am really hopeful and I am glad that I came to this awareness, because I feel like it's opening up a whole new, beautiful way of life for me that is more balanced and more accepting of myself and even others. Because as I learn to accept my mistakes, I'm also becoming aware of how I can be more compassionate towards others around me. Yeah, and so that's the video for today. I would really love to hear your thoughts about mistakes, and let me know, are you afraid of making mistakes? How has this affected your life? Or have you never been afraid of making mistakes? Have you always had a healthy view of them? I'd love to hear everything you have to say. Share with me down below in the comment section, and as always, like, subscribe, and when you subscribe, you have to ding the notification bell and check the box so that you get notifications when I'm posting a new video. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. As always, I'm sending you so much love. Take care of yourself. Bye. The number two thing that, number two, what is this? Okay.